Hello, everybody, and welcome to our final installment of The History of Human Dissection, Superstition, Science, and the Soul, the last part of our four-part lecture series on the history of human dissection in Western culture. And as I promised you at the outset, we bring so many aspects into this. The way that science and art and the humanities all mingled together to bring about what we understand today as the rise of the modern scientific movement cannot be discounted. And I like to remind us, I think that we would be in a much better place if science listened more to humanistic approaches, as well as the humanities approaches, learning what they can from the science. The great age in Western culture we know as the Renaissance was a remarkable period in which humanistic, philosophic, even theological learning was not alienated completely, not utterly divorced from what happened in scientific circles. And if we move back into our lecture, we left off last time talking about this really remarkable image from Leiden in the Netherlands. We talked about the shift, how anatomy, the prosecution of human anatomy, human dissection, took on a slightly different look in the Protestant countries of Northern Europe than it did in the southern countries of Catholic Europe. And this is the Leiden Anatomy Theater by night. And you can see here a very, very bustling, thriving public dissection, as we saw 80 years previous in Vesalius. Here you have one of the purposefully built anatomy theaters, and just like Vesalius's theater, it is theater in the round. And anatomy theater, that has to be emphasized again. These were places where the body, the interior of the human body was publicly performed. It was stage spectacle. At some of these places, in Padua, for instance, you could, during the carnival, during Lent, the season leading up to Lent, carnival, you could actually, in your full costume from out parading, you could, in the evening, enter into one of the dissection theaters. You could pay a little money, and you could get to see a dissection performed right in the pre-Lent festival period. And at some of these, you had really elaborate staging, the theatrical nature of how the body was performed. Sometimes the corpse would be beneath the stage, beneath the surface level of the theater. And when people came in and sat down, when the lights went out, you would have the candles all around the body, and it would be raised by a lift. It would be the corpse would be raised to the center of the stage to perform the dissection. Girls sold oranges in the stands of these things. Here you see a very vivid, bustling dissection scene. All the town surrounded here. And if you look, what you have really are a number of concentric circles, all right, radiating from the circle on which the body is, that table, that kind of oval-shaped table on which the body lies. And then you have these concentric circles widening, widening, widening out. And what you have here, among other things, is a replication in the anatomy theater of what we understood the cosmos to be. By 1610, the idea that the sun was the center of the universe, and all of the orbs that surrounded the sun in these ever-expanding concentric circles with the universe, with what we know as the sun / Earth, depending upon whether you were heliocentric yet or you had accepted Copernicus's ideas, and most people had. You see at the center there our solar system and everything moving out. And so what's happening in the anatomy theaters here is a reminder of what we've talked about in previous lessons, the macrocosm versus the microcosm. These Christian peoples believed that the body was a microcosm, that everything that you would find in the body would be found in the larger macrocosmic universe. In the same way, that which was in the universe could be found in the human body. So that by looking inside human bodies from a dissective perspective, anatomizing human bodies, you could literally begin to chart and understand everything that existed in the heavens. It's not surprising that the period from about 1485 all the way through 1600 that we've been dealing with in the last few lectures, that's the period of exploration. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, and all of these unnamed places, at least for Europeans, were given places, the process of discovery, given place names. Columbus would travel, all the 16th century explorers would travel all over the world, and they would find territory that had been previously unknown to them, to European culture, and they would name it. They would put a name on what they had discovered. Think about what's happening in the dissection theaters like this one in Leiden. Doctors, physicians were opening human cadavers, and they were finding things in the body, bones, clusters of nerves, organs, glands, things that nobody had ever really seen before and certainly had been unnamed. So in the same way that The globe itself was being circumnavigated, broken down, named, so too the human body. It's not surprising that many of the structures found in the human body are named for the anatomists, Columbus-like, who braved the investigation and actually found those things for the first time, named them. In this particular image, we return to Vesalius 80 years prior. You have a female cadaver on the table. Again, the womb is opened. That at the very center of these concentric circles that represent the universe itself, you have the female womb again. The world is not, we said before, the world is not necessarily geocentric, nor is it necessarily heliocentric. You want to find out what is at the center of all creation, which links us most, not just to the natural world we inhabit, but to the eternal world of God. It can be found in the womb, because that's where form and matter were joined, where the material of the body, in this case the woman's egg, the material of the body when it was joined with sperm, two material substances, two absolutely things made out of matter, right, that can be measured. When those two things came together, a third thing happened. The immortal soul joins into it, so that this sperm and the egg, the fertilized egg, now is joined with form. Matter linked with form gives us humanity, gives us everything in the universe, according to these early researchers. Back to the picture. You can see that all different levels of social strata are represented here in the anatomy theater. There's the doctor. He has his book. He has the open womb. And right in front of the anatomical table, you have a skeletal Adam and Eve, as if to reinforce what I just said. The skeleton of Adam, the skeleton of Eve, posed in such a way. You see the apple there in the hand of one of the skeletons. What you have here is that reminder. What is science? Science is knowledge, scientia. It is knowledge. And oftentimes, it's knowledge that is forbidden or has at one point been forbidden. You think about the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were placed there by the Lord, and they were given one injunction as a bulwark to ensure their own freedom of will. In other words, if Adam and Eve could not choose anything in the Garden of Eden but God, then they weren't really free. And so God placed the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. And again, knowledge, scientia. And here you have a clear indication in the picture that what's being pursued here is a knowledge that is both this worldly and otherworldly. A knowledge that takes us back to the Garden of Eden, a knowledge of the human body, which, if Genesis is correct and human beings are made in the image of their Lord and Creator, what is it that you will find here? Notice also, right above the head of the anatomist, you have a cabinet. And in that cabinet are a number of utensils, a number of surgical tools, but also something quite remarkable. It's a big compass, a very large compass. At the very center of that cabinet, with the legs of the compass opened over and above that table. So in the same way that you use a compass to draw a perfect circle, right? One leg of the compass is firmly fixed on the table or the paper, and the other leg of the compass moves freely to draw a circle. Now, circles here are the image of God. To people in the medieval and Renaissance world, the circle was the image of God because it had no beginning and no end. It signified eternity. And if you think about the wedding ring in Western culture that people wear, it is also a circle, and that's its primary purpose. It's a circle to suggest that the love between the husband and the wife have no beginning and has no end. It's a symbol of God, too. The geometric symbol of God was the circle, again, with no end and no beginning. And if we return to the picture, you will see that the circular activity at the very center of the universe can be measured by the mind of man with a compass, right? That compass, which draws a perfect circle, also can measure circles. And with each corresponding layer that goes beyond it, you have a remarkable statement here that is philosophical, that is ethical and moral, that is spiritual and theological, as well as being really highly scientific. It is absolutely telling that right in the front of the table, the dissection table, you have two perfectly articulated human skeletons. Skeletons that had been once human beings, that had been stripped of all their blood, flesh, fat, and marrow, taken down to the bone, the bones boiled clean of any remaining flesh, and then they were put back together by the anatomist. Now think about that. You take that which is made in the image of God, you dissect it, you deconstruct it down to its basest parts, and then it's the hand of the anatomist that puts it back together again. This really is a pretty powerful declaration that the anatomist, the scientific researcher here, he, perhaps, maybe more than anyone else, for these individuals. It comes closest to replicating what God does. That may be anatomical science, through the paradoxical process of pulling apart what God made to put it back together again, makes the anatomist a kind of God figure. We'll see this. We've seen it before, and we'll see it moving forward. And if you move to the second picture, this is that same Leiden anatomy theater by the day, in daytime, when there are no public dissections going on. In the daytime, the Leiden Anatomy Theater became literally a museum of death. You still have the body. Assuming the night before was the dissection that you just witnessed, here you have the body still sprawled out on the dissection table, covered with a sheet. And you see a couple of tourists, a couple of curiosity seekers who've gained admittance to this museum, probably paid some money to do so, and they're pulling the curtain back. Go back to the theatrical metaphor here. As I said before, well before there were play theaters, dramatic theaters in Europe, they had these anatomical theaters. The very first drama of the Renaissance was primarily a drama of the body, a spectacle of the body, revealing its secrets, being opened. The sheet that lays across this cadaver is being pulled back in the same way that a curtain would be pulled at a regular theater, dramatic theater, to begin to expose the actors and the course of the play. And so notice, too, that all around the museum, you now have articulated skeletons, horses, camels, all sorts of different animals, deer, goats, animals and human beings, people and animals that have been pulled apart and then put back together. In the upper right-hand corner, you have a skeletal horse that's being ridden by a skeletal knight. And you can see all the different banners that are held by these skeletons. They say such things as, "Remember, man, that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." We are but dust and shadows. In other words, the banners themselves contain philosophical and scriptural injunctions to the anatomist and to all those who enter the anatomy theater. What you're going to see here is the body on display. And whatever scientific value that has, and with every decade that went by, the scientific value of these dissections became more and more significant. Nevertheless, however much you greedily pursue science for science's sake, knowledge for the sake of knowledge, never forget, and without all those people around, you see Adam and Eve much clearer, don't you? And not only do you see Adam and Eve in front of the table much clearer, you see the tree of knowledge. You see them reaching for that fruit. Because hubris, there are some things that the mind of man was not meant to know. Think about the dystopias of the 21st century, how much of the great books, many of the great literary texts of the 20th century warn us about what happens from a too materialistic, too rationalistic, too scientific understanding of human nature. From Nurse Ratched and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest to 1984 and all these other great books, there's a warning about exactly this. If scientific knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's sake, if it loses its moral and, yes, even its spiritual underpinnings, it becomes tyrannous really quickly. It comes to treat people like objects and creates in the place of religion and philosophy an ulterior form of worship. The worship of the human mind and reason, which is a very sterile thing to most of our dystopian authors of the 20th century. You look back at the picture there. That Adam and Eve skeleton with the tree of knowledge, that's a warning that you can go too far. So on the one hand, the anatomy theater in the first picture portrayed the anatomist as a kind of god at the center of the universe, about to take apart God's creation only to put it together again in the name of knowledge. Almost a divine attribute of the anatomist. Here, with all the people gone and the celebration of dissection over, now that same space, that same cadaver, those same skeletons give an opposite meaning, a philosophical and a theological one, that remember, man, that you are dust. And that for all of your incredible powers of contemplation and reason, you still are a fraught, sinful thing, something incomplete in and of yourself. And if you allow the pursuit of knowledge to remove yourself from the pursuit of virtue, from the pursuit of morality, from the pursuit of the right way of understanding God and His kingdom, His universe, you've done a transgressive thing. And so all those, beyond the pictures that we've talked about, you can see some other interesting things in this picture. Bottom left-hand corner, you see a dog walking through. Dogs, again, were among the animals most favored for vivisecting after the dissection was over. Bottom right-hand corner, you have a woman and two male spectators. They're holding something. Actually, it's a flayed skin. Go back to Bartholomew, go back to Michelangelo, go back to Rialdo Colombo. The two men and the woman are contemplating a skin, a human skin, that in this instance appears to have been flayed off in the same way that you would peel an apple in the attempt to peel the skin without breaking it. Here, too, you have a recognizable human skin, feet to head, that's been quite artistically stripped from the body, the muscles that underneath it, and they're contemplating that. And so in this new theater of dissection, you have what goes on at night, the raw pursuit of knowledge, and what goes on by day, the godlike deification of the anatomist, and what goes on by day, a warning to the anatomist that he too will die. And what a paradox this is. We've mentioned a number of times already how dangerous it was in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century to be an anatomist because they did not have refrigeration. They did not understand the transmission of pathogens and disease. So you have bodies, sometimes bodies that were left unattended too long after death, bodies that it took too long to get to the dissecting table from the gallows, bodies that were themselves sick with diseases, infected blood, corrupted organs. And so you've got these gloveless doctors using very sharp instruments deep inside the caverns of the body to hack away at things and to cut away at things, shards of slivers of bone. It wouldn't take much to get open wounds on your hands and to have those wounds infected. So in other words, the very anatomist who at one level was a god is the very anatomist too who was most suspect to being corrupted to the death by the very bodies he worked on. What a remarkably vivid, incredibly conflicting, shockingly intellectual, stunningly spiritual, mindlessly superstitious at times process the whole thing was. And we move forward. Many attempts have been made to try to recreate the museum that were the anatomy theaters. If you look at our next picture, universities like Harvard have spent money to create, through articulated skeletons, the ethos, that feel, the philosophical, spiritual feel of the anatomy theater. Here you have a skeletal individual standing there with a sign that says Vita Brevis, life is short, it's fleeting. Another skeleton, our knight figure, so to speak, on the back of a horse, skeletalized. And there on the right-hand side, you see a modern attempt to recreate the story of Adam and Eve. There is the tree, there is Eve with the apple, Adam to her right, and there is the serpent, the one creature in the entire image that is not skeletalized. And that's a remarkable thing. It's symbolic, right? I mean, there's obvious practical difficulties in articulating the skeleton of a snake, given all the fine rib bones that transverse the length of its body. They're not easy creatures to recreate as skeletons. But nevertheless, there's also a moral lesson here, that the one creature that is immune to death in this context would be the serpent, The serpent becoming in Christian iconography a synonym, an analogy, a metaphor for Satan. And so you see the power of that Adam and Eve, by choosing the apple, have already died. Even though she hasn't eaten it yet, simply the act of picking the apple, disobeying God, ushers in the promise of death, and the serpent Satan hovers over that, immune to the physical decay that comes with the process. And moving forward, one of the most absolutely remarkable aspects of all of this for me, my interest in this, I got interested in the history of human dissection because of my interest in art. The power of artists like Michelangelo and Da Vinci. We mentioned the degree to which Da Vinci was a dissector. Da Vinci was such a fine dissector of human bodies in the late 15th century, early 16th century, that he actually has drawn pictures of certain places in the body that we have a hard time getting cameras into. So some modern anatomy texts still defer to some of Da Vinci's illustrations to convey a visual image of something that it's very hard to see, both with the naked eye and even with the power of modern photography, modern cameras. Here we have one of my most favorite images. And we move from the Italian Renaissance, we remove from that Catholic background to a very Protestant one. This is the great artist Rembrandt van Rijn. And here is his anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicolaas Tulp, 1632. We're progressing into the 17th century now. And what a wonderful image this is. This is a civic dissection, obviously. You wouldn't dress like that for an anatomy. Anatomy was messy. There were lots of fluids, lots of tissues that were being, to be delicate, splattered here and there. Everybody here paid money to be part of this picture. This anatomy lesson, there's Dr. Tulp at the cadaver. People paid. Each of these people who are figured here are prominent figures, prominent people in the Netherlands at the time. And they paid good money, a shockingly high amount of money, to be represented here as part of this civic dissection. Now, it's not a public dissection. People can't just walk in. It's not a private dissection like the one we saw in Rialdo Colombo's image. This is a civic dissection. These are all highly important men of the city, and there's a lot of cachet that comes to them, celebrity cachet, for being painted by an artist of Rembrandt's skill at a public dissection. And so, as we've seen many times, the standard procedure in dissecting bodies, again, in a pre-refrigerated age, is to start with the abdomen, is to start with that part of the body that has the most water, hence the most bacteria, the part of the body that is the most corruptible. And yet, this dissection doesn't start there. If you go all the way back to that first dissection by image of Andreas Vesalius standing next to a cadaver, and he's picking away the skin of the arm as well. You go back here and you see the same thing. Dr. Tulp has decided to begin his dissection not in the abdomen or the thorax, but in the arm. And again, we mentioned before that one of the main reasons for this is the hand, the human hand with its opposable thumb, unlike any other animal in the world. That ability to oppose his thumb that way allows him to play the violin, allows him to wield a scalpel, allows him to sculpt, to paint, all these things that signify our relationship with God. In many ways, for the Renaissance, it was the hand, more than any other aspect of the human creature, that signified its divine origins, the sublime nature of the human hand, which has all of this dexterity, the ability to create and to make tools, to take a block of marble and with great delicacy carve it into the statue of David, to be able to paint the way Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel, or the ability of the surgeon, the power of his hands to use tools to delicately cut into the most forbidden, hidden recesses of the human body. But there's something else going on here. It's a civic dissection. It suggests the intersection of research, patronage, and civic pride. This is clearly a scientific experiment that's taking place. The patrons had to pay to be part of it, so they're patronizing the study of science and getting rewarded for it by being portrayed in their fanciest clothes, right? And you can see the way they do. The three figures at the very head of the dissection leaning greedily forward, the three bearded men at the center, forming a little triangle. They may have actually been the first donors. The other men around those three most likely were painted in later as more money, as more people wanted to become part of it. Particularly the two on the left, bottom left, seem to have been added later. But all the curiosity over what Tulp is doing, all that absolute fixated concentration on how the doctor is doing his business. So you also have, at the feet of the cadaver, you have the anatomist, then you have the body, and you have the book. Most likely, again, the Fabrica of Vesalius. And no one's looking at the book except possibly one of the two men at the bottom left. The book itself, where the doctor, the Tulp, is trying to demonstrate something either from the book or oppositional to the book. It would make sense that as a Protestant anatomist working in the 17th century, if that is indeed the text of Vesalius, that Tulp is at great pains to demonstrate where he differs from Vesalius. And if you look at the same image again, move to the next slide, some really fascinating things in the Rembrandt painting. The cadaver is the source of light in the painting. That the cadaver itself, greenish, yellow in hue, it seems to, look, the closer the figures get to the body, the more they seem to light up, as if there's some kind of LED lights just underneath the skin that cast the light forward, because this is the center of everything. Most remarkably, though, the painting captures the moment where Nicolaus Tulp uses his forceps to make the fingers of the dead man's hand move. You can see the forearm has been stripped of its skin. that what Tulp has done, it was his forceps, is he's grabbed onto the flexorum digitorum muscles in the forearm. And by lifting those muscles with his scalpel, the fingers of the dead man's hand would curl into a fist. In other words, we talked about the divine nature of the anatomist. In this regard, notice what the anatomist claims to be able to do. He can make a dead man's fingers work. He can reanimate a dead body. With his forceps latching onto those muscles, he can cause a human fingers to ball up into a fist. What a remarkable moment that the anatomist has chosen, the artist and the anatomist have chosen to portray here. It's the moment when the soul is gone from the body. The body's dead. That which was immortal in the body is gone. It's now just matter with no form. And do you see what the anatomist claims to be able to do? To provide, without God, the anatomist provides the form. The anatomist, with his tool, is able to make the human hand work as it was meant to work when the soul was still in it. An absolutely shocking, shocking moment. The epistemological consequences of what's happening here are staggering. What you're seeing here is the birth of modern science, and the idea that science doesn't need, perhaps, God to work, that maybe the scientist himself is God and can master things of the universe. Within a century and a half, you'd be getting things like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a warning that when Frankenstein himself was a gifted anatomist, you may recall, a gifted surgeon, physician, and yet he wanted more. Like Faust, 100 years before, Frankenstein wanted to be able to create life. He didn't want to just dissect dead bodies. He wanted to put them together, and not just put them back together as skeletons to be mounted in museums. He wanted to take body parts from the cemetery and weave them back together into a living organism, an entity. He wanted to create, right? Not just study what was created, this act of hubris. And when you go back to the image, we can never forget, right? The intersection of scientific research and the human individual. Because that's where we are, right? What is the most important thing? The research of science or the subjects of scientific research? Are we researching in scientific ways to benefit and preserve the dignity of human beings, or does the dignity of human beings, and even of animals, is that absolutely demoted in the name of a ruthless pursuit of science? The warning in the modern world, of course, is the latter, that science becomes so unpersonal, so divorced from morality, ethics, and dignity, that bodies become little more than chattel or cattle that can be disposed of in the name of science as is deemed necessary. We know the name of this criminal that was executed. His name is Aras Kint, alias Adrianzun. He was executed for armed robbery. We know quite a bit about the man and how he ended up on this table. The inability to divorce. He's not just some nameless body, right? Modern dissection sometimes will keep the head wrapped, or they'll keep like a plastic bag around the head, so that first-year medical students who are dissecting the abdomen or the torso or the arms, the limbs, they don't see the face of that which they dissect. It's a way of kind of trying to shield medical students from the human element, right? If you can't look into the face of the corpse, you might be more inclined to treat it as a scientific object. I'm not sure that's the best way to go. Divorcing radically the human quality of interacting with what used to be a person by covering the face. Here it's not covered, and we know exactly who it was. This is another illustration from Rembrandt. This is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Jan Dijmen, 1656. This painting was actually mostly destroyed by a fire in 1723, which is why you don't have the top half. This is what remains of it. It was much larger canvas. But the central part remains. You can see the doctor, the physician, standing behind the corpse, which is sort of propped up so that the head is up. You see the assistant, the doctor's assistant to the left there, and he has in his hand what looks like a bowl, but really isn't a bowl. It is the skull, the top of the skull casing that has been sawed off to provide access to the brain. The skin of the scalp has been peeled down over the cadaver's ears like a kind of winter cap, and what you have exposed is the brain. And you can see the doctor delicately with those fingers and those opposable thumbs, right? He holds the scalpel. It's at the moment where Dr. Dijmen is about to take the human brain where the two lobes intersect and peel it apart like an orange. And what's he after here?
he's trying to expose to the audience, and we don't know who that audience is because much of the rest of the painting has been damaged. It is, from what we can tell from preliminary sketches, it was a public dissection, and there would have been students present. He's going to peel the brain in half, like an orange, to expose the pineal gland. We call it the pineal gland because it looks a little bit like a little pine cone. At the very base of the brain, in the spine, where the spine meets the brain in that area, you have this pineal gland. And for hundreds of years, doctors knew it was there, but they didn't know what it was. They didn't know what it did. It was actually quite recently when modern physicians, modern science determined what the purpose of the pineal gland was. But in the 17th century, they did not know. As a matter of fact, the great, absolutely great French philosopher René Descartes, he of cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am fame, Descartes, who dissected bodies quite prolifically, he believed that the pineal gland was the place in the human body that housed the soul. So you're at the moment now when Dr. Diamond is about to peel the brain apart to expose the pineal gland to demonstrate that part of the human anatomy where they believed the soul was housed. And notice, too, beyond the scientific significance of this, notice the foreshortened picture, right? How the feet jut out as if you're standing right in front of them. The illusion of art. One of the things that made Rembrandt such a great painter. And if we moved, we do know, right, that this is the body of the Flemish tailor, Joris Blackjack Fontaine, right, who was executed for felony, body brought to the anatomists, and the display of, again, anatomy as prelude to exposing whatever it was that was divine. Also a haunting image, right? You can see the private parts of the cadaver in this particular pose are shielded by that curtain, by that sheet. But you do see the gaping chasm where the abdominal tissues, organs, muscles were all removed. And if we move forward, by the time you get to the 18th century, all right, anatomy had burgeoned. You have medical schools now popping up all over Europe and in America too, by the way, where you had similar problems in America to what you had in Europe. Too many medical schools, population had exploded, many, many more doctors were required, but still very few cadavers. Because if, in America as well as in Europe, the only real place you could get bodies were executed felonies, right? People executed for committing felonies. This is the famous surgeon and anatomist John Hunter, 1728 to 1793. Hunter had at the time of his death, over 14,000 different anatomical preparations of over 500 species of life on this planet. Animals, people, all sorts of birds, fish, fowl, creatures that had been brought to Hunter's Anatomy Theater, dissected, and then reassembled as anatomical monuments. Over 500 species, 14,000 of them. At his death, the Hunterian Museum in Scotland, named after him and his brother William Hunter, the more famous of the two brothers. But to this day, you can go in Scotland to see the Hunterian Museum, which is one of the most grisly and fascinating collections of articulated skeletons from all across the flora and fauna of the fauna, and particularly of the world. Hunter was part and parcel with his brother William of the sort of horrifying case of Charles Byrne. And we have the slide to show you. Charles Byrne, the Irish giant. He lived from 1761 to 1783. He died very young. He was a full 7 feet 7 inches tall. He suffered from a condition known as acromegalic gigantism. We now know what its origins are. We now know what that particular misorder does to you, this kind of gross gigantism. 7 foot 7 inches tall. In the 18th century, he became a complete celebrity. Charles Byrne, the gentle giant, the Irish giant. He went to London, the freak show capital of the world, where he made quite a good living for a few years by having all sorts of comparisons done, by entertaining people, by becoming an attraction that people came to see. Well, Byrne was very terrified that the Hunters, particularly John and William Hunter, that they wanted his body, that they were keeping an eye on him to add to their curiosity collection. So terrified was he of being anatomized and reassembled this way that he actually paid lawyers, paid friends, to make sure that when he died, he would be buried at sea in a lead coffin, sealed lead coffin, and then have himself buried at sea so that the anatomists couldn't get their hands on him. Well, he died young, as is very often happens with this condition. He died very young, in his early 20s. And the Hunter brothers, John in particular, they bribed a number of people to obtain the body. The lead casket was filled with stones and other things to make it seem heavy. It was buried at sea. Meanwhile, the body of gentle giant, he was renowned for his good humor, his affability. The body of the gentle giant, Charles Byrne, was shipped to the anatomists at the Hunter house. And if we go to the next picture, oh, and by the way, I'm sorry, you can see, before we move, you can see just how big he is in that image. Today at the Hunterian Museum in Scotland, you can see him. You can see the 7-foot-7-inch tall skeleton of Byrne. And one of the things that's happening now at the Hunterian Museum is a huge debate about what to do with the skeleton. More and more people are starting to come to the argument that it's really a crime to hold on to it, that people want it buried at sea. A recent survey of the Scottish people done by the museum overwhelmingly demonstrated that the sentiment of the people was to give the man, finally, after all these years of having his body criminally taken and exposed to view of whatever scientific and curiosity influence this has had, however remarkable a story it is, maybe it's time to let the man's final wishes be honored. So with every year that goes by, we get closer to the removal of the skeleton of the Irish giant and its burial at sea. Again, the intersection of science. The science says this is far too fascinating a specimen not to dissect. Notice what happens, and you can begin to see the arrogance of the rise of some modern scientists, right? It doesn't matter what Charles Byrne wants. Science dictates that his body is much more important to human beings as a tool of research and curiosity than we should argue his superstitious wishes not to be buried, not to have his own human remains dealt with in the way he saw fit. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Again, with every year that goes by, the cry grows a little bit louder to return his body to the sea where he had sort of bequeathed it. And if we move to the next image, this touches off a real problem in Europe and in America. There weren't enough bodies, we said, for all the new medical schools. All the new doctors that were needed as population in the New World and in Europe exploded. Medicine modernized, but the executions decreased. So for instance, by the middle of the 1800s, the middle of the 19th century, they were executing in England roughly 55 bodies a year. Relatively small, but they needed over 500, they needed more than 10 times that many bodies to staff the medical colleges. So what happened? This is where entrepreneurship intersects with science and faith and science and superstition and science and religion, right? The bodies were necessary, but there weren't enough of them. The laws had humanized quite a bit, so you weren't just killing people, executing primarily men for simple crimes like theft anymore. It required usually murder to get yourself executed. And so with that, a tremendous drop in the number of bodies available. And cue the rise of the grave diggers, the grave robbers, the resurrection men who took dead bodies, resurrected them from the grave, and handed them over to the doctors. And it was an absolutely terrifying process. People all across Europe, London in particular, were horrified, and it happened in America too, where these ghoulish men would sort of linger in the poorhouses, linger among the sick, and they would wait until the bodies were buried, interred, usually within 3 or 4 days after death, and they would hover, and the very first night they could, they would sneak in with their tools, they would dig into the grave, they would remove the bodies, quite ingeniously often. They wouldn't dig straight down into the grave, because you would be able to see if a fresh grave had been disturbed on top. So what they would do is they would dig laterally. They would go to the side and they would kind of bore down diagonally to where the coffin was. And then they'd pull the side of the coffin out, the bottom side of the coffin down, the wood coffin. Then they'd use their hooks to drag the body out and up, and then they'd carry it to the anatomist. In fact, the whole premise of wakes, of having wakes, it goes back thousands of years, but particularly in places like Ireland, the concept of waking, somebody had to stay alive or be awake with the body from the time that the person passed to the time they were safely in the grave. That was for two reasons. One, to prevent any malign spirits or demonic impulses, vampiric things, from taking the soul of the body. They believed that the soul sometimes hovered around the body for 2 or 3 days before it went off to its eternal reward. Waking was a way of keeping the soul company and stopping it from being corrupted by malign influences. But in the age of anatomy, another reason for waking, staying awake, until the corpse was buried, was to protect it from body snatchers, grave diggers. And why 3 days? Because usually after 3 or 4 days, the body had begun to rot so much that it was no longer useful to the anatomist. After 3 or 4 days, the usefulness of a cadaver was gone because it was too difficult, too messy, too smelly, too dangerous to try to dissect them. And so you'd wake for 2 or 3 days, then you'd bury it. These resurrection men got really good at beginning to find out how the best time to get them. And the European, the London population were terrified by this. They would start leaving flowers or pebbles in certain arrangements on top of the grave so they could tell whether or not the grave had been disturbed. Go to and that image there of a man toting away a body in a sack off to the anatomist. We have another image here, right, of a woman's body, right? They had managed to dig in laterally, like we said, on a diagonal, and they are now just retracting the body by looping a noose around the head and dragging her out of her grave so they can take her to the anatomist. And what's really remarkable about this is the anatomists understood. They knew where the bodies were coming from. Again, a classic example of the pursuit of science for science's sake, getting in the way of morality and ethics. This is exactly why you had a skeletal Adam and Eve. It was a warning, wasn't it? That if your pursuit of science becomes so inhumane, if it ceases to serve humanity and becomes inhumane to the point of this kind of cruelty, for the anatomists, well, they're dead, right? There's no problem here. And we have such a shortage of bodies, why not steal them? And they paid good money, sometimes as much as £10 for a fresh cadaver, which is a huge amount of money in the day. We mentioned Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which in the 18th century, late 18th century, was all about this, all about the morality. At what point is too much? Can the pursuit of science move us too far the wrong way? You had a hugely frightened populations now that started purchasing the people who had money. The poor people on Skid Row had no such options, which is why mostly it was their bodies that ended up on the dissection tables. People, men and women of means, lead-lined coffins, grave cages, elaborate heavy metal steel construction cages over the corpses, over the coffins in the grave, so that if you were able to dig through the dirt, you'd still have to try to navigate this cage. Something called mort safes. Safes for the dead, literally, mort being the French word for death. These mort safes were elaborate metal containers into which you would put a wooden coffin or a coffin of some other material to make it even harder for grave robbers. What a gruesome phrase, resurrection men, right? And do you see how the word resurrection, utterly devoid from its religious meanings? To resurrect a corpse this way is not to make it live again as Jesus did for Lazarus. Or himself. It is to simply resurrect the dead body to be dissected in the anatomy theaters. And that leads us to the Burke and Hare murders. Not surprisingly, given the shortage of cadavers, given the burgeoning science of human dissection, people figured out quickly that a lot of money could be made resurrecting corpses. And the most logical thing is, the fresher the body, the more recently dead the corpse, the more the anatomist paid, which led, not surprisingly, to people like Burke and Hare, who engaged in suffocating, killing people, and then dragging them to the anatomy theaters right away, the doctors, so that the freshest possible bodies, the anatomists loved it. Burke and Hare, they were two Irish, I guess you'd have to call them entrepreneurs, wouldn't you? These were men who saw a market, saw a niche, and filled it. Two Irish entrepreneurs who took the body shortage to the next level. Between 1827 and 1828, November to November, in 1 year's time in Edinburgh, Scotland, 16 murders they committed to provide fresh corpses for the anatomists. They took the bodies. What they would do is they would lure mostly poor people, mostly indigents. They'd lure them to their lodgings, and then they'd get them absolutely stone cold drunk, at which point they would pass out or they would be too weak to resist. And then William Burke and William Hare, they would suffocate them. sometimes with a pillow, sometimes with a hand, sometimes with a mattress. They would suffocate these poor people, drunken poor people, until they were dead. And then they would immediately load the bodies up in either barrels or in tea cases, and they would drag them directly to the doctor, Dr. Knox, Dr. Robert Knox, a famous anatomist in Scotland. For the very first body they brought him in 1827, he paid £7 10 ounces, which is a staggering sum. And when they figured out how much, now the first murder, it must be said, the very first murder they did was somebody who owed them money and who happened to die in their lodgings of natural causes. In order to try to reclaim their money, because now that he's dead, they can't really do anything to him, and he owed them money. The family wasn't obligated to pay them. They took the body to Dr. Knox. They got £7 10 shillings, and it dawned on them, well, if we can get £7 10 shilling for a body like this, what would we get for more fresh ones? So Burke and Hare, William Burke and William Hare, for about 16 corpses in about a year. What ended up happening? Well, they were finally caught. For a variety of reasons. People got suspicious, local people were disappearing, and the clothes, not only did they sell the bodies for money, they kept the clothing and sold it on the secondhand market for a good price. And so people were starting to see, these people who had vanished, starting to see somebody showing up in one guy's trousers, or that dress, that smock was worn by the woman that disappeared. So all of this came to light about a year later. And in the trial itself, it was remarkable because there were no bodies left as evidence. So the prosecutors were having a very difficult time getting a conviction until they did what prosecutors have always did. They picked one of the criminals, William Hare, and his wife, and they offered them absolute immunity to testify to the truth. They testified about everything they had done, names, dates, places, the 16 victims' names. Burke was then convicted, hanged, and in a tremendous amount of poetic justice, his body was ordered to be publicly dissected. And there it is right there in the museum in Edinburgh, Scotland. You can still see him. There he is, the notorious murderer, William Burke. That's his skeleton, articulated, speaking its own truth about morality and ethics and the limitations of scientific research too. Yes, that too, as you can go study his body. So, engrossed by the case of the Burke-Hare murders, where the English public, that Dickens himself, Charles Dickens, managed to get his hands on a piece of the skin from the corpse of Burke when he was dissected, and he used it, dried it out, Dickens did, and used it as a bookmark to keep his place. Little mementos of Burke's body were taken by many people as kind of macabre souvenirs. And the Burke, and most importantly for the end of our story, the Burke and Hare murders led to the Anatomy Act in London and England of 1832. And in the Anatomy Act, finally, after a century of these kinds of grave robbings, the Anatomy Act of 1832 actually allowed doctors and physicians the privilege of accessing the bodies of poor people in the workhouses and the hospitals who died without any family to claim them. Tragically true that many of the poorest of London's inhabitants died alone, died without family to claim their bodies, died without money to pay their medical bills or even their burial expenses. And in the shortage now of executed bodies, which were the right of the anatomists, it was those poor people who had no representation and no money. The doctors were now legally allowed to access those bodies to dissect them. And it was a sad commentary, perhaps, on the state of civilization, but there were so many more of those bodies than there ever were executed felons that the doctors thrived, that it was no longer necessary to hire men like Burke and Hare. It was no longer necessary to lurk around cemeteries at night. The medical schools and the hospitals were provided with all the corpses they could use in their researches. And that's probably a really good place to wrap this up, because you've reached the point now where medicine has modernized to the point that such macabre experiments, like public dissection itself, began to go away. Medicine quickly modernized. The tremendous leap forward that is the scientific revolution was underway. And with it came, despite all of its spectacular help to medicine and research and science, the other aspect of that, too, that we have, in other words, embraced the scientific nature of medical research, and we have been largely unwilling to grapple with, at least enough, the moral and the ethical concerns. Things like cloning now, right? Where the United States has a while ago banned cloning, particularly cloning of human beings, which set off a firestorm in the scientific community. Many scientific researchers appalled that mere lawmakers would dare to suggest a limit to their research, leaving the country and going to places like Mexico, where you don't have such strict prohibitions. This idea, again, warned about in so much 20th century dystopian literature. What's going to happen when science has so officially divorced itself in the name of reason from philosophy, from theology? From morality and ethics? What's going to happen when that's done? And there's an unrestrained pursuit of science for science's sake. Takes us all the way back to the Garden of Eden, which, let's not forget, Garden of Eden, like the story of human anatomy, it's a story of death. And what does death mean? And can death be redeemed, right? To the anatomist, the felon executed for a crime who appears on the anatomy tables has made a penance for his sin by allowing his body to be publicly dissected. In the Garden of Eden, right, there's a different kind of resurrection man, right? If the modern scientific research gave rise to the resurrection men, the Garden of Eden gave rise to one resurrection man, Christ Jesus. And so you see here the implications of all of this and what a really fascinating story it is for the history of Western culture. Thank you so much for joining us, and please keep your eye open for new lecture series coming down the road. We appreciate your attendance and hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.